Today on Mother Mayhem.
The idea that growing up, something like the silent treatment probably wasn't unheard of for you. The silent treatment was probably something you very likely experienced as a kid with your mom. The idea that you said something, didn't say something, did something, or didn't do something that caused her disdain and would lead her to pull back, to not talk with you, to not engage with you, to not be in the same room with you. That was likely a real experience that you had, not just a fear that you would have, but that you developed a fear of that happening because your mom had that tendency to do that. Welcome back to Mother Mayhem, the narcissistic abuse recovery podcast for daughters. Hi, I'm your host, Heather Gray. I'm so very glad you're with me today. We're diving into a really important topic that I have a feeling might be near and dear to your own hearts. We're going to be diving into a conversation around what it means to be a people pleaser inside relationships or to be a perfectionist inside your own relationship with yourselves. If you've been in the narcissistic abuse recovery space for a while and you've been learning about this either in your own therapy, in the self help section of a book, in videos on YouTube, or in posts on social media, the idea that daughters of narcissistic mothers or those kids who have had early childhood trauma have a tendency to become people pleasers or perfectionists, that's not going to be a new idea for you. This is something that you're going to have heard before. I first want to explain to you how this happens because I think sometimes by the time you've reached adulthood and somebody has said, "Hey, have you thought about setting some boundaries with other people?" Or, "Man, you're so conflict avoidant. Why don't you just have the conversation? Why don't you just tell somebody what you think? It's really no big deal. You can do it." You arrive in adulthood and you arrive to this place where the way you're moving through the world isn't working for you. But people make the solution to this seem so simple by saying you just need to set boundaries. You just need to communicate your thoughts and feelings. Tell people what you want them to think. All of those things are things you're going to hear from me. You're going to hear a little bit about boundaries in the end of this episode. You're going to hear more from me in the next episode around communication and how to talk to people about your thoughts and feelings and how to share your experiences with other people. But you have already come to this episode having your own experiences and your own understanding of how being a people pleaser has affected you or how being a perfectionist is affecting you. You can see how it's helping you have the relationships you want. And my guess is you can also see how it's interfering in having the relationships you want, either interfering in your relationship with other people or interfering in the kind of relationship you want to have with yourself going forward. That being said, the people pleasing and the perfectionist seeking comes with a lot of shaming and blaming in the conversation. I think we talk a little bit about it and we forget a really important part of the conversation when we're talking about this. So before we go any further, I want to remind you that survivors of childhood trauma have been protected by their brains. Your brain, as it was experiencing your mother's disdain, your mother's judgment, her inconsistent, erratic behavior, learned to protect you. One of the ways it learned to protect you was by training you and helping you to learn how to scan for risk. Your brain taught you how to monitor your mom's body language, her word choice, her word tone, her volume, the way she spoke to you, the way she moved through the world. You learned to monitor all of those things and scan all of those things so you could create a set of learned behaviors of what to do in response to her to avoid criticism, to avoid blaming, shaming, gaslighting, and all the different ways she would traumatize you as a young kid. You became a people pleaser because your brain wired you for protection, how to avoid criticism, how to avoid negative reactions, how to avoid conflict. This didn't happen just because you were simply altruistic. This didn't happen because you aimed to be the most selfless person on the planet. This happened as a learned behavior for navigating the relationship with your mother. Because you learned this at such an early age, you then started to simply apply it to all of your relationships with everybody else, because that's how you learned how to do relationships. Your first relationship was with your mother. You learned relationship skills with her. Nobody interrupted you at the time when you were a kid and said, "Hey, you don't have to do all these extra things for me. You don't have to be the most perfect child on the planet in order for me to love you." Nobody pulled you aside to say, "Hey, stop. You can just be a kid. Don't worry about it. It's okay. You don't have to be perfect." So you had a childhood on repeat of learning how to avoid the most harmful behaviors your mom would choose, how to avoid the blaming, the naming, the criticism, the judging, and all of the ways that she impacted you in a negative way. Now, as an adult, what you're learning and seeing and experiencing is that learned behavior no longer works for you. Your perfectionistic tendencies are likely getting in the way of the relationship you want to have with yourself because you find yourself in a constant state of having a negative tape playing in your head or that inner critic telling you you coulda, shoulda, woulda done something better. Or you're finding that it's impacting the relationships you're having with yourself. You're so focused on being the perfect partner, the perfect friend, the perfect person for someone to take care of them, to attend to their needs, that you've long ago neglected your own needs and your own awareness of your own experience inside of a relationship with other people. You may be experiencing people pleasing, disrupting friendships, working relationships, romantic partnerships, any kind of relationship that is significant in your life may be touched by your people pleasing tendencies, and the relationship you have with yourself is likely being impacted by your perfectionistic tendencies. As I help you understand yourself in this conversation going forward, I don't think I can just leave this description of how you landed as a perfectionist or as a people pleaser and put it all in the defense mechanism basket. I think that oversimplifies a really difficult and painful experience you had as a child. And if I just lump it in and say, "Hey, you do this because it's a defense mechanism, you can stop using this as a defense mechanism, you don't need it anymore," I think that disrespects and invalidates the experience you had growing up with your mom. So, if you'll allow me, I want to go into a little bit more specific detail of how the people pleasing tendencies and perfectionistic tendencies were created in you or developed inside you as a way of moving through the world. I'd like you to listen to this with an ear with self compassion. I want you to hear your experience through my eyes, the lens of a, trained and experienced therapist as a way of understanding how you got here. I don't want to just say it's a defense mechanism and move on from it. It's oversimplified and it doesn't take into account the incredibly emotional experience all of you have overcome that have brought you to this conversation with me. The first thing we want to address is that most people pleasing tendencies and perfectionistic tendencies started with an attempt of meeting your mom's expectations. But for her, she was always moving the line. In order to please her, in order to avoid conflict, you were trying to meet whatever you thought she might want, need, or seek on any given day. And because the expectations were inconsistent and could vary from one day to the next, you were constantly trying to be the best version of yourself for her in order to avoid not meeting her expectations, which would also often come with a negative response or conflict or naming, blaming, shaming, or gaslighting. I think it's fair to say that most people who struggle with narcissistic personality disorder or narcissistic tendencies are largely and wholly incapable of love. That is one of the hardest truths that comes when you start to identify that you're the daughter of a narcissistic mother, because it means owning the fact that feeling you had of your mom not loving you, of your mom not choosing you, of your mom not caring about you was a real and true experience. You grew up largely thinking it was your fault. that if you dressed in the right way, if you spoke in the right way, if you got the good grades, if you cleaned the house good enough, or if you did X, Y, and Z, you might then earn your mother's approval and love and affection and nurturance. But oftentimes, what you would experience as a kid is that her love, her attention, her affection, and her nurturance were largely conditional. Seeking unconditional love was an endless setup for failure. But as a child, wanting approval and wanting connection and affection and attention, you would consistently try for that. We hear a lot of times in the narcissistic abuse recovery space around the idea that people pleasing and perfectionistic tendencies come from this place of seeking out unconditional love. And I would largely agree with that. I think the root of it is seeking unconditional approval. And I think including the word approval into this conversation is relevant, particularly when we're talking about narcissistic abuse recovery, because narcissists are incapable of love. I would probably also argue that they're largely incapable of approval because they're really only looking to get their needs met. So the only thing they can really approve of is themselves on any given day. But I do think that daughters of narcissistic mothers know what it's like to be on their mother's good side versus bad side. So, learning that from early childhood on, you learned how to move through the world so you could always stay on someone's good side or stay on your own good side by being a perfectionist. A lot of that people pleasing and perfectionistic tendencies and the push pull and the balance between both largely come from a desire for unconditional love, acceptance, and approval. You didn't have that as a child, so you've become and found yourself in an endless quest to get that as an adult. It's also really likely that one of the reasons why your brain wired you for protection, wired you towards this people pleasing, perfectionistic response is out of a fear of abandonment. The idea that growing up, something like the silent treatment probably wasn't unheard of for you. The silent treatment was probably something you very likely experienced as a kid with your mom. The idea that you said something, didn't say something, did something, or didn't do something that caused her disdain and would lead her to pull back, to not talk with you, to not engage with you, to not be in the same room with you. That was likely a real experience that you had, not just a fear that you would have, but that you developed a fear of that happening because your mom had that tendency to do that. So you became a people pleaser and became a perfectionist with yourself, with the idea being that if you stayed good enough, if you were perfect, if you always said the right thing and you did the right thing, your mom wouldn't leave you. And that becomes a habit that gets developed in adulthood in your other relationships that you have to overextend yourself. You have to be an over giver. You have to be super thoughtful and super generous and super committed in order to be worthy and deserving of the love that's in front of you, the friendship that's in front of you, or the collegial relationship that you're experiencing at work. Your story as a result of being raised by your mom is that as soon as you are the weakest link, as soon as you don't do the right thing, don't make the right choice, you are on her bad side. You are in the dark side. You are facing her gaslighting, her blaming, her shaming, her disapproval. That becomes this universal experience that as soon as you're not good enough in any of your relationships, you are going to earn the disapproval of those that you're interacting with. The other thing that I don't think gets talked nearly enough, I think a lot of times when we talk about narcissistic mothers and we talk about narcissistic abuse recovery, we forget the idea that a lot of narcissistic mothers often put their daughters in a parentified role. Your narcissistic mother may have had you raising your other siblings. You may have found yourself largely responsible for taking care of other little kids in your house instead of your mother doing it. Your mom may have put you in a position where you were taking care of her instead of her taking care of you. if you're using those parentified tendencies as a little kid, when you learn them as a little kid and you do them on repeat, you end up with this habitual way of moving through the world as the world's parent, as your friend's parent, as your colleague's parent, as your romantic partner's parent, because you've learned in that parentified way of moving through the world has simply become so ingrained in you. We can't go very far in the narcissistic abuse recovery space without hitting on and bumping up against a conversation around boundaries. Narcissists, by definition, have no boundaries. The only thing they care about, the only thing they consider are themselves and their own needs. And when you grow up with someone who has no boundaries and extends their personal space into your personal space, it becomes really hard to even know that you have such a thing as personal space. A lot of you who are struggling with narcissistic abuse recovery and childhood trauma recovery and CPTSD, this ongoing conversation around boundaries and learning yourself and understanding your needs, you have been having this conversation with yourself for quite a while. And you probably have done some work on it, and you're finding yourself here on this podcast because there's more work to be done on it. Because the idea that you lived in service of your mother and in service of relationship with your mother meant that you weren't in consideration of yourself. You never learned how to identify your own needs, your own wants, your own desires, or your own thoughts inside a relationship with your mother. Your thoughts and your feelings toward your mother or about your mother were largely weaponized by her. So, as a result, her perception of the world, her needs of you, her expectations of you largely ran the show. And you never successfully learned how to connect with yourself, your own needs, and your own preferences because you address it now. You've been hearing me so far in this episode use the phrases people pleasing or perfectionism largely interchangeably and together. I'd had a thought about whether or not I wanted to separate these two tendencies and responses to narcissistic childhood upbringings in separate episodes so that people pleasers would get their own episode and people who struggle with perfectionistic tendencies would get their own episode. But I don't know a lot of people pleasers who don't also, on some level, struggle with perfectionism. And I don't know a lot of people who struggle with perfectionism that don't also have some tendency towards people pleasing. However, I do think it's important for the sake of this conversation to separate them out a little bit, not just for the logistics of it all and semantics of it all, but as a way that I can help you better understand yourselves. Because at the heart of narcissistic abuse recovery is improving your relationship with yourself so you can have a better relationship with yourself, but also so you can have a better relationship with other people. And I think that starts with understanding and increased self awareness. So, if you'll allow me, I think some of this might be stating the obvious, but for those of you who may be a little bit newer to the conversation, or those of you who are just used to having perfectionism and people pleasing lumped in together or glossed over, I'm hoping that by breaking it down and having a more in depth conversation with you about these things, you'll have greater understanding of yourself and thereby have an easier time having a better relationship with yourself. So, let's dive into that. The thing that I want you to most focus on as we try to separate these two tendencies, the people pleasing tendency and the perfectionistic tendency, is the focus on behavior. People pleasers are going to tend to prioritize meeting the needs and expectations of other people over their own needs and expectations. So they tend to seek validation, approval, and peace in their relationships. And as a result, they overextend themselves and they go to really great lengths to avoid conflict, to avoid someone's disappointment in them, and to avoid not meeting someone's expectations. We talked about that earlier, where we said it became a learned behavior because you were avoiding not meeting your mother's expectations, because that would open you to naming, blaming, and shaming behavior on her part. Where perfectionists are slightly different in their experience around the focus on behavior is that perfectionists, instead of being focused on the other person, they are largely focused on having this flawless relationship with themselves, to do things perfectly and flawlessly so that they can have high expectations of their own work and their own esteem and their own ability to interact with other people. So their main drive, their main ambition in being a perfectionist is to attain perfection and avoid making mistakes or falling short of their own self imposed ideals. So they're not trying to please anyone else. They're in this habit of trying to please themselves. Likely because they got into that habit of trying to always avoid conflict with their mother or always trying to meet their mother's expectations. And as a result, they kept raising the bar for themselves because if they could be more perfect, if they could do more and be more and achieve more, perhaps then their mother would see them as worthy. Perhaps then their mother would see them as enough and experience them differently in relationships. So that tendency, it's a slight difference, but I do think it's important for people to understand this when they're trying to better understand themselves. The other thing that's really important in this conversation is to consider motivation. So, people pleasers are going to be motivated by that fear of rejection, criticism, and disappointing someone. That's what we were just saying, right? Like they're trying to avoid naming, blaming, and shaming behavior that their moms would often put on them. They're trying to avoid the gaslighting, the pressure filled sort of echo chamber that their moms would somehow create if they could just please everybody and overextend and overgive and overdeliver. They will never have to hear another bad word about themselves. People pleasers have this really strong, intense desire for acceptance, and they seek validation from other people. Perfectionists are looking for their own self validation. They may, in fact, recognize that they're never going to please other people, so they try to please themselves. And they know in the story they create in their head is that if they raise their bar, if they raise the expectation for themselves, they're bound to please other people. But what they're really trying to do is create these perfect outcomes to match their own ideals and their own standards. It's also really important to think about the effect these behaviors have and how far that net gets cast. People pleasing behavior often gets focused on interactions and relationships with other people. So you're prioritizing someone else's needs or desires, often at the expense of your own well being. Perfectionists, they're a little bit different though, because they often find their perfectionistic tendencies aren't just in relationships with other people, but they're in all aspects of their life. You might be struggling with perfectionism in making your own personal achievements and how you work and how far you go up your work ladder, how you dress, what you look like, what you sound like. It involves excessively high standards of perfectionism across a lot of areas, not just how others see you, but how you see yourself across the board. And lastly, there's an emotional component to this. And the fact that it's a lastly item is probably an error on my part because all of you are here because being raised by a narcissistic mother and having this experience brings you intense emotions that can be hard to deal with. But people pleasers are going to experience anxiety or guilt or discomfort when they cannot meet the expectations of other people, when they perceive a potential conflict with someone, or they perceive that they may have disappointed someone else. They often place a significant amount of attention and priority on maintaining that harmony and avoiding disapproval with other people. They are looking to protect the peace inside of relationships with other people. In contrast, perfectionists may experience that intense self criticism and dissatisfaction or anxiety when they fall short of their own high standards or mistakes. So you can see that perfectionists and people pleasers, so much of it is the where the attention is on pleasing themselves or pleasing other people. But that push pull dynamic of wanting to be enough, of wanting to be worthy, of avoiding conflict, of avoiding the naming and the blaming and the shaming behaviors, where the focus of attention is different, but that experience is very much the same. That's why often in these conversations, you'll hear people pleasing and perfectionism used interchangeably. It goes without saying that people pleasing and perfectionistic tendencies are exhausting. We've talked in previous episodes about what it means to be caught in the fight, flight, or freeze response and to always feel like you're scanning for potential risk. Chronic people pleasing and chronic perfectionism is a huge component of this, that you're always scanning for other people's satisfaction or for your own satisfaction. It always feels like the line is moving. So you get pre wired for stress and hypervigilance, and you are fueled on the anxiety around being good enough and taking care of people. So, what's missing from that, oftentimes, and you probably too also know this all too well, is any form of self compassion or self validation of your own needs or your own experiences. The idea of self care, of taking care of yourself before someone else, putting the oxygen mask on yourself before someone else becomes almost a stressful event because it makes you think that while you're focusing on yourself, you're not focusing on someone else, and then a potential conflict could disrupt, or somebody could change their minds about you, or you could face abandonment. So that toll of always trying to be worthy, always trying to be good enough is a large part of what fuels that anxiety that we talked about in previous episodes. So if you're struggling with anxiety and hypervigilance, and you haven't listened to that episode yet, it might be worth going back and having a listen there because we definitely talk about it way more in depth than I'm going to be talking about it here. It's also really important to understand that there is healing that's possible here. I didn't give you this podcast episode to just say, oh, because you have a narcissistic mother and because you're pre wired for people pleasing and pleasing yourself, this is a personality trait that's ingrained in you and there's no hope for you. There you go, off with you. I'm not in any way, shape, or form looking to send that message. I do believe that decreasing people pleasing tendencies, starting to improve your relationship with yourself, lowering your own expectations of yourself is possible when you are working on narcissistic abuse recovery. When you're acknowledging that trauma largely informed and impacted these behaviors in your life, that at some point in time they worked for you, that they have stopped working for you, I do think that there are ways that you can start increasing your comfort level with saying no, with prioritizing yourself, taking care of yourself first, and moving through the world with a way where you matter as well as the relationships in your life matter. So it probably is of no surprise to you that this is where I introduce you to the concept of boundary setting. And I don't know a lot of narcissistic abuse recovery sources for content, information, books, programming that don't also include a large, significant component of boundary setting. I am not going to be having the be all end all conversation around boundary setting in this podcast. I think it is something that is constantly a work in progress for those of you who never learned how to do it. But the best form of self care, the best way you can get that oxygen mask on yourself is to introduce yourself to the concept of boundary settings. But the problem that I think happens a lot in most conversations around boundary setting is people say, oh, you just need to. And often it's just say no. Just think about yourself first. Ask yourself what you want and then stick to that first. The problem with that narrative and the problem with giving those directions is they're largely ignorant of what it truly means to be recovering from narcissistic abuse. Think about what we said at the beginning of this episode, that people pleasing and perfectionistic tendencies came to be as a direct response of your mother's narcissistic abuse and neglect. Your brain wired you for protection, not for connection. So, as a result, you are not just protected from the abuse and the harshness of other people, you are blocked from having your own relationship with yourself. So, when someone says, just do what you want, most times in my experience, daughters don't know what they want as adults. They like somebody can say Chinese or Mexican and they have never given it a thought whether or not they want cereal or a bagel for breakfast. They don't consider these things because there have been bigger fish to fry, bigger things to manage, more important things to pay attention to. So they never came to know their own preference. It's like that scene in Runaway Bride with Julia Roberts and Richard Gere. Many of you are coming to this podcast and you may not know how you like your eggs because for your mother, it was scrambled, for your aunt, it was fried, for your father, it was this. You learned how to make decisions and choose things based on the preferences of other people. You never learned how to do this for yourself. So before you can start saying no to people or drawing lines in your relationships with people, this goes back to having a better relationship with yourself and increasing your own self awareness around your own preferences. That's where I want to start in this conversation. I'm going to help you say no. I'm going to help you say no, thank you. I'm going to help you say not now, but later. I'm going to help you say, what you just said to me hurt my feelings. I don't like the way you talk to me here. All of that is going to be discussed in future episodes. That we're going to be digging into these conversations on the regular because they're the hardest part of narcissistic abuse recovery. But before we can go there, before we can dive into the juicy sort of situational things that you find yourself in, we have to help who you are in these situations. The first step to doing that is reflecting on your own values and your own needs. Figuring out how do you carve out some time for self-reflection and curiosity. Figuring out what are your boundaries. It often isn't about, I don't want you to do this, I need you to do that. It often starts with, what are your values? What are the things that you care about? What are your belief systems? And what are the needs that you have that are most important to you? You're going to want to think about the aspects of your life that you want to protect and that you want to be carefully kept. And you want to pay attention to situations in your life where you've become uncomfortable, where you can tell a boundary has been crossed. You might not even know how, but you know where your peace has been disrupted and how it's been disrupted. You want to start cataloging that and getting to know yourself, understanding your values and your needs and your beliefs. That is going to be the core piece of a foundation around boundary setting. I was joking with a client the other day. We were having this conversation and she was talking about an open door policy and that as a result of her childhood with her mom always isolated her and kept her from others. She said one of her favorite things about adulthood is having this open door policy that like her friends and her people know that if they have a spare 20 minutes, they can swing by the house. And if she's available, they can ding dong the doorbell and come on in and have a cup of coffee and sit down and have a quick cup of tea. And I listened to that and I was like, no freaking way would I be able to pull something that off. I need to know when my friends are coming. I need to know what time, because if somebody came to my house unannounced, I would immediately get nervous around the state of the guest bathroom, whether or not my house was clean enough, whether or not I had a plan for my overreactive dog. My comfort level and my sense of safety and security means a boundary over my time and over my physical space. I need to know when people are coming. But her experience of the way she was raised and how she moves through the world, safety and security comes from being in connection with other people, with having the kind of relationship with other people where they feel comfortable just stopping by. Both are true. Figuring out where you land as you move through the world on all of these different topics and things requires time for curiosity. How do I feel about this? When do I feel the most at peace? When do I feel like my peace is being disrupted? You want to pay attention not just to how you would react in situations, but how you have reacted in situations, not just your values around time and space, but also paying attention to your emotions. Where you get uncomfortable is a good indication of where you might need a boundary. I was talking to somebody the other day who said that in meetings, she has a really strong reaction to gossip, that the idea of other people talking about other people around her makes her deeply uncomfortable. And we were able to trace that to her childhood as well, because her mom was quite the gossip. And her observation of her mom was that she could gossip about one person, and then the person she was gossiping with could be the target of her next gossiping session with someone else. And so for her, sitting and listening to other people talk about other people who aren't present made her incredibly uncomfortable. Others of you might find that you have negative reactions or discomfort in other situations. We all have our own lines and our own tolerances based on our own experiences and our own interpretations of experiences. So, if you were to start to keep a notebook of times you felt the most uncomfortable, when you felt like your skin was twitchy and you weren't quite sure what to do, you will start to notice your own boundaries. If somebody is calling you too often, emailing you too often, if somebody is talking to you in a way that doesn't feel respectful, if somebody is talking down to you, how people make you feel when you are interacting with them, whether or not you feel safe and secure and seen and validated or open to judgment or shame or blame, you will know. And paying attention to your emotional experience and your responses to people and situations, that is going to be a good indicator of where you might need a boundary. You're going to want to look at recent experiences, but also, too, don't be afraid to scan back and go, gosh, the time I was most uncomfortable was when? A time that I said yes, and it really was a hard yes to stick to was when? What are the situations that made you deeply unhappy? Some of them are going to be the abusive situations with your mom, but other times they're going to be those moments when you fail to show up for yourself because you were so busy people pleasing or reaching your own expectations that you failed to show up for yourself. But if you look at the way it's been for you in the past, you are going to get a lot of information there about yourself. This is information you have known all along, and it's been available to you all along. You just haven't been using it because it would create potential conflict in your perspective. You worried that considering yourself would interrupt a relationship you had with other people, or considering yourself and your own needs and your own energy level would interfere with your own ability to meet your own perfectionistic tendencies. If you can give yourself some time to ask yourself questions around when were you the most uncomfortable? When did you feel like your peace was disrupted? You will start to gain insight into your own preferences and your own needs. It's important to think about in the boundary discussion, it's very easy to be thinking about terms of yes or no. But boundaries, we encounter them in so many things. They're in our physical space, they're in our emotional space, and they're in our time, financial space. What our preferences are and what our needs are happen across so many different situations. Boundaries are going to encompass all aspects of your life. So you want to think about what are your physical comfort zones? Do you prefer to have people near you or around you? What are your emotional thresholds? How much can you tolerate? Some of you are going to find that you really like talking about your trauma, for example, with other trauma survivors because it helps you feel less alone. Some of you listening in are going to find that your emotional threshold is highly different and you can barely handle your own trauma. So listening to someone else's traumatic experience is going to send you over the edge. You want to think about the amount of time and energy you're willing to invest in people and activities or in situations. These things are what's going to help you define the boundaries in all these areas of your life. At the end of this episode, I'm going to be including a link in the show notes for journaling prompts that you can use to walk yourself through the conversation I just had with you. The needs identification list, the values identification list, the beliefs identification list, all of those different things. I am going to offer you a journal exercise that you can link to create some private space for yourself to explore and get to know yourself in these areas and come to an understanding of your own boundaries, your own limits, and more realistic expectations that you can have for yourself inside of relationships with other people, as well as expectations to have for yourself inside of your own relationship with yourself. That being said, I do think it's important for me to start to talk about the idea that narcissistic abuse recovery happens best in the company of other people. By learning to have healthy relationships with other people, by learning to have trauma informed connections with other people, you learn to have healthier connections with others and with yourself. This kind of exercise around boundaries and values explorations is a good opportunity for you to try to connect with a safe person in your life in a meaningful way. This type of intervention, including someone else in this discussion with yourself that you're having, allows you the opportunity to hear yourself and your expectations and your experiences reflected back to you. You're so used to navigating all of this on your own, deciding that your anxiety, your hypervigilance, your increased need to have the approval of others and people pleasing or your own high expectations are entirely your problem. But healing happens in the company of others. I encourage you to think about the safe, meaningful relationships that you already have in your life that are kind and warm and considerate of you, and I would encourage, after you spend some time alone navigating this conversation with yourself, looking at your own boundaries, looking at places where you have been uncomfortable, including a trusted loved one in this conversation. Because having someone else's observation of you and the way you move through the world could be really meaningful in identifying people pleasing or perfectionistic tendencies that you have that you might not even be aware of, but it's also a really good opportunity to have your needs and your perspective and your understanding of yourself and the world around you validated by someone who cares about you. If you're at the point of your own narcissistic abuse recovery where it really is just you because you're the only person you trust right now, that's okay. I know it's a really lonely place to be. I know that it leads you to feeling largely disconnected from the world around you, but we just want to recognize and honor that this is where you are right now. It's not where you're always going to be. That's why you're listening to this show and considering this work. I wouldn't want you to open yourself up for a conversation with somebody who you don't think can carefully keep a conversation around your values and beliefs and needs and boundaries, because this might be the first time you're having this conversation with yourself. So we want to set it up for success. If we don't think that someone is going to be safe for you, it's best that you keep it to yourself until you learn how to build and create safer relationships with people who do consider you and who do care about you. And so we'll just take it one thing at a time. As I look at the outline for this conversation that I was having with you, I did expect that I was going to go through some situation examples of how to set boundaries once you've identified your own needs and values. But I'm looking at the recording clock here, and we're about 40 or so minutes into the conversation. And I don't want to lose your attention, and I don't want to lose your focus, and I don't want to minimize the attention I'm trying to create on you exploring your own needs and your own values and your own experiences. So, for the sake of integrity of the topic that I'm offering, I think this is where I'm going to end this conversation for today. And next week, we can pick it up with examples that I can run through and offer on how do you communicate what your needs are once you know what your values are, once you identify what's uncomfortable for you and where you feel uncomfortable moving through the world. How do you begin exploring that with other people? What are some sample scripts that you can say? How do you begin to approach this? How do you start talking to people about your needs and your comfort level with things? I think that actually deserves its own episode. We're going to start to get really situation specific. I will offer as many different sort of regular everyday examples in future episodes, But that's also the hope of where I'm intending this show to go. As I finish up this episode with you today, this is largely where the introduction to my framework around narcissistic abuse recovery ends. Obviously, I want to include next week's episode where I give you specific scripts. But in these first episodes, I've introduced you to the idea of what narcissistic abuse is, how it's impacted you, what it means to have childhood trauma as a result of your experience, how to have a better relationship with yourself, how to have a better relationship with other people, how to navigate the triggers and the anxious, hypervigilant responses that you encounter in your regular everyday. And now today, we talked about people pleasing and perfectionistic tendencies. And how do you begin the conversation with yourself around boundaries? Together, these 6 episodes I'm offering you offer the framework for narcissistic abuse recovery. But this is just the beginning of the conversation. I wanted to approach this topic very deliberately and in the specific order so that you had a framework to feel safe and secure operating from going forward. But my real true dream for this show is that after this and in future episodes, you will have felt comfortable enough reaching out to me with your specific experiences, that you will ask questions, that you will say, in this situation, this is where I got stuck. This is how I'm managing this right now. What do you think? And that we can start to help all of you who are struggling with this issue in as close to real time as possible. If you have listened to these episodes and I have successfully earned your trust, I really encourage you to reach out to me. My email address is heather@daughtersnpd.com. So you can include a voice memo, you can include an email, any question you have, any situation that you find yourself in. I truly do want you to reach out and allow me the privilege of coaching and guiding you through resolution and better understanding with yourself and better understanding with other people. For now, a good place to start is that journal prompt worksheet that I have offered for you. A link for that will also be in the show notes. And take the time to explore this with yourself. Do consider taking the time to have a conversation with a close and loved friend or colleague or loved one and share your experience and see what someone else thinks about all of this. Begin to include safe, loved, meaningful people in your recovery. You do not have to do this alone. But for now, I am always in it with you. Thank you so much for having this conversation with me over the past 6 weeks, and I certainly do look forward to talking to you again next time. Bye for now.
I really appreciate you tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the show and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or follow it on your favorite podcast app. If you know another woman who needs this show and its conversation in her life, I really do hope you'll consider sharing it with her. Your feedback's going to help me build the show into what we need it to be. I'd really, sincerely, truly love to hear from you. You can also find me and connect with me over on Instagram at DaughtersNPD. Until next time, take care of you and know that I'm in it with you. Thanks for listening to Mother Mayhem. Bye for now.